Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into the topic of slow playing. We'll break down the individual factors that impact our decision to slow play so that you can win the absolute maximum the next time you hit a strong hand. These are the three main factors we'll be discussing. First of all, we are more inclined to slow play when villain bets big as opposed to when he bets small. Secondly, we are more inclined to slow play when we are in position. And finally, we are also more inclined to slow play when the stack to pot ratio is low. Let's get into the first factor, which is that we are more inclined to slow play when villain bets big. And the reason for this is that a big bet is actually an indicator of a more polarized range. Imagine if your opponent were to bet big on the flop, for example, let's say a pot-sized bet. He's probably not going to have hands like middle pair and under pairs because those hands, for the most part, just want to get to showdown. And even if they did want to bet for thin value or protection, they typically wouldn't use such a big size because that's just going to isolate themselves against stronger hands such as top pair. So if you think about the composition of the big bet range, it's mostly either going to be very strong hands or bluffs. And this also means that the times that you do call this big bet, villain is very likely going to continue barreling on the next street because all of these strong value hands that he has are probably going to want to continue betting, and he's also going to have to mix in a fair amount of his remaining bluffs as well. And that's actually great for slow playing because the times that we have a strong hand, we want the pot to be as big as possible. So we either do that by raising ourselves, or in this case, because our opponent is so aggressive the times that we call, it's actually a reasonable option to just call and sort of let him hang himself on the next street. On the other hand, if we had faced a smaller bet on the flop, then our opponent's range is typically going to be much more depolarized. It's going to contain all of these marginal hands like middle pair and under pairs that perhaps want to bet for protection, but don't want to go that big. So the composition of the small bet is much more depolarized. And against such a depolarized range, we typically don't want to do much slow playing because we can expect the next street to go check very often. Most of these middle pair and under pair type hands, they're really just going to be checking behind on the turn if you call the flop because they've already accomplished what they were trying to accomplish, right? They've already folded out the overcards that they're trying to deny equity against. And also the times that you call the flop, your range becomes much stronger as well. So a lot of these marginal hands are not going to even be strong enough to consider making some kind of thin value bet on the turn. And so the times that you have a nut hand, it's not going to be a great idea to call this small bet, knowing that the turn is going to go check so often. Here's an example of this effect. On this ace-queen high board, button open versus big blind call, you can see button is using two distinct sizes. He has this overbet that's built around mostly hands like two pair, stuff like stronger top pair. There's 25% top pair in the big bet range, and you'll notice that most of these top pair hands are actually the ones with the higher kickers, such as ace king and ace jack, and really not that many marginal hands because if button did have a hand like a queen, it just doesn't make sense to go for such a huge bet and isolate yourself against all of the top pair hands in the big blinds range. And by contrast, if you take a look at the composition of the small bet range, you'll see that it's much more weighted towards marginal hands. Queen X is now 17% of the small bet range, and there is a similar amount of top pair, but if you take a look at the strength of these top pair combos, you'll notice that it's actually mostly built around top pair with weaker kickers, hands like a6, ace5, that don't have quite as much equity as ace king and ace jack, and of course there's also quite a bit less two pair, right? 1.8% as opposed to 11% when it comes to the big bet range. And the overall effect is that the button will just tend to barrel the turn much more often after betting big on the flop. If we take a look at what happens on a blank turn, you can see button is barreling more than half the time, and it's pretty clear why this happens if we look at what the various hand classes in the button's range are doing. right? Hands like sets and two pairs, they're really clear value bets on the turn. And since most of the top pair combos are actually stronger top pair, right, the hand class of top pair actually ends up betting at quite a high frequency as well. So there's barely any, there's not that many hands that are giving up, right? Of course, he has to give up like a little bit of air, but that kind of depends on how good or bad the turn is, right? If the turn is like a deuce, it's not like a great turn for the button, in the sense that none of his bluffs really get there, so there tends to be a little bit more checking with air. So to get a better idea of how aggressive we expect the button to be on the turn, we can also take a look at the turn reports. Right? Basically, on average, button is barreling a little bit more than half the time, about 55%. And what we also want to do is compare this with the barreling frequency after button makes the small bet on the flop. So let's take a look. Right? Basically, we see that the turn barrel frequency has gone down by quite a big margin. Button is now checking the turn almost 2/3 of the time. And the reason for this is that button has way more marginal hands in his range. So if we take a look at a blank turn, for example, right, now it's not just, button's range is not just comprised of hands like top pairs and two pairs and sets, right? There's way less of those hands. The top pair that he does have, even these hands, they're like weaker top pairs that are a little bit more inclined to check the turn. And of course, he's going to have like a whole bunch of second pair and third pair that are pretty much checking at 100% frequency. It just makes very little sense to bet Queen X on the turn, right? Once again, because you've already made the big blind's range quite strong by betting the flop. So even something like King Queen or Queen Jack is not going to have quite enough equity to be a comfortable value bet on the turn. So all of these hands are going to pull down button's turn barrel frequency. And if you think about the effect that this has on the big blind strong hands, and now if we go back to the flop, knowing that button is going to check back so much after you call this small bet, right, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to call something like two pair or a set on the flop. Right? Whereas if you were facing a bigger bet with these hands, then now you can see the big blind is doing much more slow play, because the big bet is much more polarized, and you can sort of count on the button to continue being very aggressive on the turn. Probably the only exception to this would be top and bottom. You can see A7, it's not raising quite as often as the rest of our nut combos. And this is actually a pretty common trend. It's something that you'll see solvers do a lot. They like to specifically slow play top and bottom pair. And my interpretation of this is that top bottom is just quite a unique hand in the sense that it's not quite as strong as top two pair, but at the same time it doesn't do as good of a job as unblocking your opponent's calling range compared to a hand like bottom two pair, because most of your opponent's calling range is going to be hands like ace-x. So a7 actually blocks a pretty good chunk of that. So there's a lot of situations where we even end up raising like certain top pair combos a little bit more than top bottom. You'll see stuff like ace-jack raising more, because even though a7 is a stronger hand, but still it's a lot less vulnerable hand compared to ace-jack. Right? We actually end up denying a little bit more equity when we raise a hand like ace-jack, because we fold out some hands such as queen jack and queen 10 that are drawing, I guess they're not like drawing dead to ace7, but they're definitely drawing a lot thinner because they only have two outs to hit a queen. Whereas if we have something like ace-jack, we actually don't really mind folding out queen 10 and queen 9. Right? Of course, we would probably rather they call, but the thing is that with these hands have 5 outs against us, so it's a little bit more acceptable to be folding them out, right? There's just a little bit more value that we're getting in terms of equity denial. But still, it's not a big deal, right? The main takeaway here is that 2 pair plus as a hand class should be raising much more often versus the smaller size. Because if we just call, we know that the turn is going to go check really often. And basically you have a situation where your opponent is not really putting in the money for you. So you just have to put in the money yourself by check raising the flop and fast playing your hand. Here's a question to test your understanding. On the board of King 7 Deuce Rainbow facing a small c-bet, should the big blind A fast play his sets to build the pot, or B slow play his sets to keep bluffs in? The main difference compared to the previous example is that the board is extremely dry. There's a complete lack of straight draws and flush draws, so most of Button's bluffs are not going to have a whole lot of equity against the big blind set. In fact, they're mostly just drawing dead or drawing to runner. So the question is really whether this justifies slow playing, just to keep all of these drawing dead hands in the Button's range and hope that they continue bluffing. So you can take a few moments to think about this, and I'll show the answer in a bit. So it turns out that the texture of the board doesn't really affect our decision that much, and the main consideration here is once again how polarized or how depolarized our opponent's betting range is. As long as he's betting small on the flop, his betting range is always going to contain a whole lot of marginal hands such as under pairs, second pair, third pair. In this case, ace high is definitely considered a marginal hand as well. Hence, like ace queen and ace jack actually have a lot of showdown value on this type of board texture. And if we take a look at what these hands tend to do on the turn after we call, you can actually see that they're checking behind pretty much all the time. So once again, the presence of all of these marginal hands is pulling down the Button's turn barrel frequency, and this makes it really important for the big blind to just fast play his strong hands on the flop. And this is also something that is independent of the board texture. Whether the board is wet or dry, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to slow play your strong hand, knowing that your opponent is not going to be very aggressive on the next street. And that's the reason why 2-pair plus as a hand class is raising at such a high frequency. A more legitimate question would be, what happens if my opponent is overfolding versus the check raise? Does that actually justify slow playing my strong hands? Because in this case, the EV of your strong hands does actually go down, especially on a board like this. I doubt most players will be calling hands like Jack 10 offsuit. There's quite a bit of like ace high that's supposed to be floating as well. And if your opponent is not going to call these hands, then for sure the EV of raising your strong hands is going to go down. But it's still a little bit unclear if that's enough to make us want to slow play this type of hand. Because if you take a look at the EV of a hand like pocket deuces, for example, right, raising is actually quite a bit higher EV than calling. EV of raising is 18.1, EV of calling is 17.4. So for sure, if your opponent is overfolding, EV of raising is going to be less than 18.1, but it's quite difficult to say for sure if it's going to be less than 17.4. And don't forget that your opponent could also be making certain mistakes the times that you call. For example, if we take a look at what's supposed to happen on the turn after we call the c-bet, you'll see that in position is actually using quite a significant frequency of overbets, especially on some of these higher turns like the queen. What you'll see is that Button is actually supposed to be betting 2.5x pot and 1.8x pot at a decent percentage of the time. So if you don't expect your opponents to be doing this, then it's actually also going to decrease the EV of calling the flop. If we go back to our flop decision, hands like deuces, obviously, when you call, you're kind of hoping that your opponent will be as aggressive as possible. But now that he's failing to do this, EV of calling is definitely going to go down. So my point is really that even if our opponent is overfolding versus the check raise, yes, EV of check raising is going to go down, but that doesn't automatically mean that it is going to be lower than the EV of calling. So to me, the correct response versus someone who is overfolding is not to start slow playing your strong hands, but rather to still continue check raising them, but to check raise a whole lot of bluffs as well. So what we're doing is kind of forcing our opponent to pay off our value hands, right? Because of the presence of these hands like 8-6 suited, 9-6 suited, our opponent is kind of forced to call the flop with hands like Jack 10 and Ace High. And even if he doesn't want to call these hands, that's fine with us as well. Yes, the EV of our strong hands is going to go down, but at least we have all these bluffs to recoup the EV that our value hands are losing. So it's a little bit like buying insurance, if you think about it. In real life, we buy insurance because we're worried that something might go wrong, that we might fall sick. And no one's really going to buy insurance if you knew with 100% certainty that you were not going to fall sick. So it's the same in poker. We bluff really because we are worried that our opponent might be overfolding. And if we knew for sure that he was always going to defend at least what the solver would defend, there would be absolutely no reason to be bluffing. And so that's why it's so important to be bluffing in this type of situation where you know that your opponent needs to make a lot of counterintuitive calls. And there's a real risk that he might not be calling these hands like Jack 10 and Ace High. It's this type of situation where it's really important to have some kind of insurance and to be bluffing enough hands so that in the event that your opponent does overfold, at least you'll have some kind of insurance payout from all of these backdoor type hands that actually benefit from your opponent's higher folding frequency. The second factor is that we are more inclined to slow play when in position. And I think this is quite intuitive. It feels quite natural to just call a bet with a strong hand if you're in position, specifically because the times that, even in the worst case scenario where your opponent checks the next street, you still have the option of putting in a bet yourself. Whereas if you were out of position facing a flop bet, now it becomes much riskier to be slow playing because there's always the worry that your opponent might check behind on the next street. And now we're just going to go straight to the river, and the pot's actually going to be pretty small, which obviously is not a great thing for your strong hand. If we take a look at this in position 3-bet pot, you'll see that cutoff's response versus a c-bet is very similar to some of the previous examples we've been looking at, not just because the c-bet size is small, but also because cutoff is out of position. He's quite inclined to just raise hands like deuces and eights because once he fails to do this, there is the risk that the turn is going to go check check and then the button will be allowed to bluff catch the river in a very small pot. So the only way for the cutoff to spoil this plan is just to check raise all of his strong hands aggressively and then to mix in a bunch of bluffs. Whereas if we compare this to out of position 3-bet, so over here we have small blind 3-bet versus cutoff instead. And the way that cutoff responds versus small blind c-bet is actually quite different. Most of his strong hands are actually electing to slow play in this case, since there is no danger of the turn checking through the times that the cutoff just calls this bet. Even in the worst case scenario where the small blind does decide to check the turn, the cutoff can still easily put in a turn bet himself. So in that sense, it makes slow playing a lot less riskier. The third and final factor is that we are more inclined to slow play when the stack to pot ratio is low. Generally speaking, our strong hands have two opposing incentives. On one hand, they want to fast play to build the pot, but on the other hand, there are also hands that make a lot of sense to slow play because the stronger your hand is, the less vulnerable it tends to be. And if you think about how SPR affects each of these factors, as stacks get deeper and deeper, it actually becomes much more important to be fast playing to build the pot because you just tend to win so much the times that you stack your opponent. And that's the reason why we typically don't do as much slow playing when SPR is high, just because this first factor of fast playing and building the pot is so much more important than slow playing to keep bluffs in. Whereas in a low SPR situation, there's much less of an upside to fast playing, since even if you did manage to stack your opponent, you're not going to win that big of a pot anyway. So the second factor of slow playing to keep bluffs in becomes a little bit more important by comparison. Here we have an out of position 3-bet pot. The flop is Queen 10-9 rainbow, and because we're 200 big blinds deep, we see that button actually plays very straightforward and very aggressively with most of his strong hands, especially when you look at hands like King Jack that are not very vulnerable. These hands are just raising most of the time because even though they don't deny much equity or need much protection, but at the end of the day, the stacks are so deep that we just win such a huge pot the times that we do manage to stack our opponent. So this is what gives us more incentive to just go ahead and raise our hand. Whereas in a 40 big blind situation, what we should see is that button should be a lot more inclined to slow play with hands like King Jack, especially because now there's much less of an upside to raising to build the pot. Even the times that you do stack your opponent, you're not going to win that much anyway. So the focus shifts to slow playing to keep bluffs in. The last thing you want to do with a hand like King Jack is to raise and fold out all of these trash hands, such as ace highs and small pocket pairs. Given that there's very limited upside to raising anyway, it becomes much more important to just call and keep all of these hands in, hope that your opponent perhaps hits an ace on the turn. Or even if he doesn't, there's always some chance that these hands might continue to bluff you if you call. So overall, calling is just going to generate much more value compared to raising and just folding all of these hands out. And I also want to emphasize that this would be true even if the board was two-tone. So if we change this to the 9 of diamonds, what we see is that the button is he's still not very interested in raising hands like straights and sets versus a c-bet, which definitely looks a little bit strange because from a human perspective, a hand like nines feels quite vulnerable. There's so many turn cards that we don't want to see. Any king or jack or diamond is definitely going to devalue our hand. So instinctively, it feels like we should just be raising and trying to get the money in before one of these bad cards come. But of course, the reason why the solver doesn't do that is because it knows that raising doesn't really solve the problem. A lot of the hands that you're trying to protect against, like flush draws and straight draws, they're just not going to be folding against this raise. So when we raise with a hand like nines, it's actually almost like a pure value raise because the only hands that have a significant number of outs against us, such as flush draws and open-enders, you can see that they're just continuing 100% of the time. So nines is really not as vulnerable as it looks, and for this type of hand that doesn't deny a lot of equity, the only time that we want to fast play it is when stacks are deep enough such that there's a big enough upside when it comes to building the pot. Because in that case, we would actually win enough the times that we stack our opponent to offset the fact that raising doesn't accomplish anything in terms of protection. Quiz question number 2, small blind 3-bet versus button on the board of 10-6-3, small blind c-bets to flop and button calls. And on this flush completing turn, which hand does button prefer to raise versus a double barrel? So if your answer was B, well done. So far, we've seen that as the SPR gets lower, it becomes very difficult to justify raising hands that don't need protection, even if the hand itself is very strong. And this is exactly why button is choosing to slow play all of his flushes versus the double barrel. The SPR is so low at this point that raising to build the pot isn't really a factor. And of course, flushes are just hands that are not very vulnerable. Even a hand like 4-5 of hearts that looks quite vulnerable doesn't deny as much equity as you might think. Because if you take a look at the small blind's response versus our raise, he's not really folding that many hands with equity against us. The main hands our hand is vulnerable to would be higher flush draws, hands like 2 pairs and sets. But, 2 pair set, obviously not going to fold. And also a lot of the higher flush draws actually come with a pair. So there are hands like queens and jacks with a heart, king 10 with the king of hearts, and none of these hands are also going to fold given how little money there is behind. Even something like king jack with the jack of hearts, against our specific hand, this is really just a naked flush draw because its straight draw outs are not live, right? The times that king jack hits a queen, it's still going to be dead to our flush. And the flush draw itself, it's not even like a proper flush draw because we're holding 2 hearts in our hand. So we're essentially left with a 7-outer, and the question is really whether it's worded or it's justified to be raising our 4-5 just to fold out a couple of hands with 7 outs, or is it more efficient to be calling with a flush and just to keep all of these hands like king jack and king queen that are drawing stone dead versus our hand and hope that they continue bluffing on the river. And this also explains why sets are raising more often on the turn compared to flushes, because when we raise a hand like sixes or threes, it actually accomplishes much more in the sense that all these hands that are folding, they have way more outs against us compared to the times that we hold a flush. A hand like king jack with a heart, now it's no longer a naked flush draw. This is actually a combo draw because you can hit like a queen or a heart on the river, has like a ton of outs against our set. So pretty big win the times that we managed to fold out this hand. Even a hand like king queen without the heart, no longer drawing dead against our set. And stuff like sevens with a heart as well. This is also going to have a fair number of outs against us. It's basically a flush draw plus a 2-outer, which is like 11 outs already. So when we take a look at the button's response versus the double barrel, you'll see that sets, in particular sixes and threes, right, the more vulnerable sets, they are in fact raising at quite a high frequency. And I also want to compare this to the 200 big blind solution. Okay, let's take a look at how things change as the SPR gets higher. So now we actually see a very different situation where flushes are raising at a much higher frequency. And this is happening despite the fact that flushes are, as we've seen, not very vulnerable hands. But of course, the difference is that with the higher SPR, there's now a much larger upside to raising and stacking your opponent. Right, the times that you do manage to get it in against a worse hand, you're just going to win a much bigger pot. So that's going to compensate for the fact that your hand doesn't really deny that much equity. The last example I want to look at is this 4-bet pot over here. On this 10 high board, you can see that versus a button c-bet, small blind is doing a ton of slow playing. Hands like sets, as well as the less vulnerable overpairs like aces, there's just very little reason to be fast playing these hands. There's so little upside to raising and building the pot given the low SPR. So once again, the focus lies in calling just to keep all of these random overcards in the button's range. But something else you'll notice about the small blind's raising range is that it's very weighted towards one pair hands. So hands like top pair, for example, make up a huge chunk of the small blind's raising range. And you can see 10x is actually raising at a very high frequency. There's even hands like 9s and 8s getting in there sometimes. And the reason why this is happening is that these one pair hands have a very different set of opposing incentives. On one hand, they definitely want to be raising for protection, just to be able to fold out hands like king queen and a-shack. That's a pretty big win for us to deny 6 outs worth of equity against these hands. But on the other hand, the times that we raise and we run into a hand like aces or kings, we're definitely getting stacked, right? There's just no getting away. Our opponent's going to jam and we're definitely just going to call given the SPR. So that's always the dilemma when you have some kind of one pair hand. Do you want to raise for protection or do you want to just call and lose the minimum the times that you run into a better hand? And if you think about how SPR affects each of these factors, it actually makes you much more inclined to raise for protection. Because even if you happen to run into an overpair and you get stacked by a hand like aces or kings, you're just not going to lose that much compared to if the SPR was higher. So basically, you're getting much better pot odds on your protection check raise. And this is why you'll see small blind playing like a maniac, right? Just raising all of these hands like 8s and 9s, right? Raising stuff like 6-7 with the intention of getting it in. This is something that we're pretty much only allowed to do when the SPR is low. And so your whole strategy becomes really odd. Everything is kind of upside down. Your really strong hands like sets are just calling all the time. And your one pair hands like 10x and 8s and 9s are just raising really often. Whereas in a situation where the SPR is higher, then everything starts to look a lot more normal. Our very strong hands have much more incentive to be raising and building the pot. And our more marginal one pair hands probably will be raising at some frequency, but we definitely don't want to be overdoing it given how much more we're going to lose the times that we run into a better hand. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and you can also check out my own channel at Poker Giraffe for more free strategy content.